Kell on nüüd saanud 11 ja võiksime vist alustada. Eks siis, kes liituvad veel, saavad jooksvalt liituda. Tere teile kõigile, kes te olete siia kogunenud ja aitäh, et olete tulnud Fredrik Bondestami loengut kuulama. Mina olen Tartu Ülikooli personalitöö jurist Anneliis Kilk. Ühtlasi kuulun koos teiste Eesti avaõiguslike ülikoolide esindajatega sellisesse töörühma, mis juba 2 aastat korraldab üheskoos maikuus mitmekesisuse nädalat ja mille osa kohe algav loeng ka on. Kui eelmisel aastal liitus meie tegemistega võrdõigusvolinik Kristel Veske, siis sellest aastast lööb kaasa Eesti Teadusagentuur. Mitmekesisuse päeva tähistatakse Eestis maikuu 2. kolmapäeval ehk sel aastal 14. mail ja kogu maikuu jooksul tähistatakse mitmekesisuse kuud. Aga nagu öeldud, siis ülikoolid tähistavad käesoleval nädalal üheskoos mitmekesisuse nädalat. Sel aastal võtsime fookusesse märkamise ja sekkumise julgustamise temaatika, millele on minu arvates ülioluline tähelepanu pöörata. Näiteks on meil siin Tartu Ülikoolis ette tulnud olukordi, kus kas personaliosakonda või akadeemilisele sekretärile tuleb kaebus, et mõni ülikoolipere liige käitub kuidagi ebasobivalt. Seda kaebust uurima asudes aga võib selguda, et paljud selle inimese lähedal töötavad või õppivad inimesed juba teadsid, et sellel, õppejõul on mingid ebasobivad kombed või käitumismaneerid, mis viisakasse töö või õpikeskkonda ei sobi. Öeldakse, et ta ju ongi selline. Ja just see ongi see, mida me enam kuulda ei tahaks. Sellepärast julgustamegi, et kui märkad, siis sekku. Ja sekkuda võib kas otseselt, astudes ise vahele või kaudselt ehk rääkides inimestega, kelle võimuses on midagi ette võtta. Tartu Ülikooli näitel on sellisteks inimesteks kas programmijuht või töötajate puhul töövahetu korraldaja või struktuuriüksuse juht. Mis meil siis sellel nädalal plaanis on? Eile avalikustasid ülikoolid oma sotsiaalmeediakanalites üliõpilaste videopöördumise, milles ülikoolide üliõpilasesindajad räägivad, miks on sekkumiskultuuri arendamine tähtis ja kuidas kõik ülikoolipere liikmed saavad ise turvalisemat ja hoolivamat õpi- ja töökeskkonda luua. Lisaks tutvustasime me eile sellist praktilist juhendit, mis aitab sekkumiskäitumist mõista ja harjutada. Selle juhendi leiate sellise plakati kujul oma ülikoolide infostendidelt ja tõenäoliselt saate sealt samast ka sellise voldiku kaasa haarata. See on nii eesti kui inglise keeles. Ja juhend on digitaalsel kujul leitav ja allalaetav ka Eesti Teadusagentuuri mitmekesisuse nädala veebilehel, samuti ülikoolide võrdse kohtlemise veebilehtedel. Ma lisan pärast kohe siia vestlusaknasse ka vastavad lingid. Homme ehk kolmapäeval kell 10 toimub veebis avalik ekspertide arutelu, mille pealkiri on julge sekkuda, miks ja kuidas. Selle arutelu otseülekannet saab jälgida ERR-i Innovaatori portaalis ja Teadusagentuuri YouTube'is. Seda arutelu juhib Eesti Muusika- ja Teatriakadeemia psühholoog ning võrdse kohtlemise usaldusisik Elina Kivinuk ja arutelul osalevad Triin Toomesaar, kes on pikka aega juhtinud sihtasutus Kiusamisvaba kool, Juhan Pastarus, kes on Tööinspektsiooni vaimse tervise konsultant ja Helina Loor, kes on Tallinna Ülikooli külalisõppejõud ja president Kaljulaidi fondi õpidisainer. Need eksperdid selgitavad homsel arutelul, et miks ei pruugi inimesed julgeda sekkuda ja jagavad ka praktilisi näpunäiteid, kuidas sekkuda turvaliselt ja nii, et sellel oleks ka mingisugune mõju. Nii et kutsun teid ka homset arutelu vaatama ja kuulama ja kutsuge ka kõik sõbrad, kel võiks asja vastu huvi olla. Otseülekande ajal on võimalik Slido kaudu küsida ka küsimusi. Ja on aga veel selline võimalus, et kui teile homme kell 10 ei sobi, siis seda vestlusringi saab ka järele vaadata kas Teadusagentuuri YouTube'ist või UTTV-st. Ja lisan pärast ka need lingid. Nüüd aga tänasest seminarist. Fredrik Bondestam on Uppsala Ülikooli sotsioloogia kaasprofessor ja Göteborgi Ülikooli Rootsi soouuringute sekretariaadi direktor. Oma tänases ettekandes keskendub ta soopõhise vägivalla lõpetamisele ülikoolides ja teistes teadusasutustes. Ta räägib nii ülikoolide kui ka teadust rahastavate organisatsioonide rollist ja teiste riikide kogemusest. Ka tänast ettekannet salvestatakse ja seda saab samuti hiljem Eesti Teadusagentuuri YouTube'ist järele vaadata. Ettekande lõpus jääb aega ka küsimuste küsimiseks. Võite küsida kas ise otse Fredrikult või kirjutada oma küsimused ettekande ajal vestlusaknasse. Fredrik, hello.
Hello, Annelies, and hello, all of you. Nice to see you. I don't see you actually because you don't have your screens on, but I'm visible, hopefully, for all of you.
Yes, you are.
Yes.
So please go ahead.
So thanks for inviting me for this important session, and I hope my sound is okay for all of you. I will speak like this for like 45 to 50 minutes today, and I must say, I love the Estonian language that you use, Annelies. I don't know Estonian, but it's so beautiful to listen to. So I had this kind of the same input in the Czech Republic and in Slovakia last year, and they also introduced in their languages, but I think Estonian language is most beautiful. So thank you for this invitation. I think you have introduced me, so that's a good thing. I will try to share my screen, and if someone just can tell me if this looks okay, then we can start up. Is it visible to all of you?
Not at the moment, no. Can you try again?
It's not visible at this moment. Okay, I will try again. We tried this beforehand, so it should work. I will do it once again and see what happens. I wish I were in Estonia actually holding this lecture, but now it's going to be online, so we have to live with that.
Now it's working.
It's up and it's up, yes. I will just like this, and maybe now you will have a full screen as well. So please tell me if this is okay for you.
Yes, perfect.
Perfect, thank you. Just to acknowledge that I don't view any of you at this moment. I'm just looking at my own screen. So please, if something is not visible, please tell me. We decided to use 45 to 50 minutes, just a lecture kind of from my side. And please make notes on any questions you have on any issues that I put forward. Also, don't hesitate to write long questions and put them forward in the chat and so forth. But we have a question and answer session at the end for about 20 to 30 minutes. So there will be enough time to speak up on the issues that I'm presenting. All these images that I will show in my presentation, I will make a PDF on it. I will send it to Lorna, and you can just disseminate it to all the participants. So you don't have to make any notes at this point. So you will get all the pictures afterwards. Also, I think importantly, I tried to put in a lot of references to literature, research literature, policy templates and other things. So hopefully you will get a lot of inspiration and also concrete advice and tools that you can use forward in the Estonian context. But then again, what I prepared for today is actually 5 different things. I will just shortly present the Gender Action Plus project, which is why we're sitting here today, why I'm participating today, and also the European Gender Equality Task Force. Then I will turn into the broader issue of current policies on gender-based violence in ERA. And ERA stands for the European Research Area. There will be some abbreviations today. I will try to pronounce them and spell them out properly. So I will speak up on the policy developments in the ERA, but also the concepts that are used in these policy developments, especially then the concept of gender-based violence, which is quite, it's an umbrella term that we use in ERA policy, and I think it's important that we look into it to some extent. But then I will turn into the question of gender-based violence. We will look at the prevalence of gender-based violence, consequences of gender-based violence, but also different recommendations on how to prevent gender-based violence within higher education institutions. And for this part, I will mainly use results and knowledge and policy advice from the UNICEF project. Both Gender Action Plus and UNICEF are projects targeting the ERA and gender equality, and UNICEF specifically on gender-based violence. Gender Action Plus is more a policy project on gender equality more broadly. I've been part of both projects from the start, so that's why I'm using this as a backdrop. Then I have a short input on the specific role of research funders to end gender-based violence, because we tend to acknowledge that higher education institutions have the responsibility to address gender-based violence, also to give support to victims, handle formal complaints and so forth. But we have recognized through the Gender Action Plus project that research funders might be key to actually addressing and ending gender-based violence as well. So I will give some short input on the role of research funders. And then finally, I think I've collected some main ideas on my own from working almost 30 years in the field of gender equality in the Nordics, but also being a researcher in the field of gender-based violence for more than 15 years. And I'm always trying to summarize what are the main ideas that I currently carry with me that I want to share with all of you. So hopefully that will give some kind of inspiration as an ending point. And then I think the time will be about approximately 11 o'clock in Sweden, and in Estonia it's going to be, you have to correct me, 9 o'clock or 12 o'clock or 10 o'clock. That's quite interesting. It's one hour difference, I think. So yes, anyway, we will have another 20 minutes or 30 minutes for questions and answer in the end. So the Gender Action Plus project is a policy project funded by the Commission. It's been running since 2022 in June. It's going to end in June this year. And as one part of the project, we have developed what we call the European Gender Equality Task Force. This has been led by my institution, University of Gothenburg, together with other stakeholders in Europe. And what we do is we try to visit different countries and different stakeholders in different countries and give policy advice on how to enhance and implement different gender equality measures. So I actually had an input to the Estonian stakeholders. Some of you might have been part of that last year, and now I'm visiting you again on digitally and speaking up on gender-based violence. It's been a great work, being able to visit many countries in the EU, speaking up on the different areas of gender equality in research and innovation for approximately 2 years. So it's coming to an end. It's quite sad, and this is actually the last intervention that we do in the Gender Equality Task Force. So looking then into what is the area of interest of today's lecture is, of course, gender-based violence. And to give you a really short and brief overview, what have been the developments in terms of policy in the European research area? I present this very shortly, very briefly. Maybe you know some of it, but to my mind, as a researcher and policy officer in gender-based violence, it has a long prehistory in the EU, of course, but it was obvious when the new gender equality strategy was adopted by the Commission back in 2020. It really set out to make gender-based violence a specific area of interest, and it was called to be a thing of the past. That was quite a positive way of addressing this long-range issue of sexual harassment and other forms of harassment, sexual violence and other forms of violence, of course, and saying, yes, we in the EU will make gender-based violence a thing of the past. Now, 5 years on, it's not a thing of the past, of course, but this marked a new era, I would say, of prioritizing gender equality in the EU. And this sparked an interest within the research community, within the European research area. So during the Slovenian presidency of the EU, there was a declaration developed called the Ljubljana Declaration on Gender Equality, especially targeting research and innovation. And it took the gender equality strategy from the EU as a backdrop. Now, this can be found on the internet. You can read this document, and it's quite short, but it also targets gender-based violence quite clearly. And one thing that is promoted and proposed in the Ljubljana Declaration is that the new gender equality plan criteria needs to incorporate gender-based violence. And this actually turned out to be the case in 2022, when the Commission decided on that all stakeholders, organizations in the research system in the era who wants to receive any funding from Horizon Europe needs to have a gender equality plan, and gender-based violence was pinpointed as one of the 5 areas that these organizations may wish to consider. Now, this, as you know, has been in place for a couple of years. Those of you being in higher education institutions, you have a JEP probably in the Estonian community as well. The recent developments on the JEP requirement has been quite dramatic. as you know, the Trump administration in the US have banned EDI work and different work on equality, diversity, inclusion in many ways. This has spilled over to the EU and also to the Commission, and there's an ongoing discussion whether to retract the idea on gender equality plans or to promote them even more clearly. And this is an ongoing process as I speak, really. So it's about to be finalized and decided by the strategic committee for the upcoming framework program in the era. So we really don't know whether the JEP requirement will be more mandatory and also include mandatory areas, for example, as gender-based violence, or if the gender equality plan requirement will be retracted to some extent. So this is actually ongoing discussions in the era at the moment. Now, as a follow-up to the Slovenian presidency, the Czech presidency also developed a specific call, and it's called the Prague Call for Action, and it actually targets gender-based violence specifically. And one important part of that Prague Call for Action was proposing a new zero tolerance strategy for ending gender-based violence throughout the era. It took a while, and it was processed through the ERA Policy Agenda and Action 5 on gender equality, I would say, from 2022 and onwards. And finally, at this point in time, actually in December 2024, the EU Commission has adopted what is now phrased as, and now we see the abbreviation, ZETA TA. It stands for Zero Tolerance Approach, and then a code of conduct on gender-based violence in the European research area. Meaning the Commission now is convinced that we have to implement new measures and new ideas in all member states and in all research systems in all member states to actually combat and end gender-based violence. And to my mind, this is not as, it hasn't been implemented yet fully, and this will be one of the tasks for the new Gender Safe project, which is a follow-up to the UNICEF project, which I'm also participating in. It's going to be new recommendations on how to implement this code of conduct. But what is interesting with this code of conduct is the specific arguments put forward. And there are actually 3 pillars proposed. They are called commitment, action, and accountability. And you can find it on the EU's web, of course. You can find the Zero Tolerance Code of Conduct. I think this is a brilliant policy document that could be used in a national context as an overarching framework for the research and innovation community in a specific national context. Now, commitment, and it's a long document, but commitment, it's actually all about acknowledging that gender-based violence is a part of the research system within a national context. It's not an issue of actually mapping it or doing research or doing a large survey to prove it's a part of, for example, the Estonian research and innovation system. We already know it is through the UNICEF survey, which I will speak up on shortly. So the commitment is all about acknowledging that we have a major, what is called an endemic problem of gender-based violence that is targeting the staff and students of our higher education institutions. And this then turns into the second pillar, which is all about action. Now, the ERA and the EU will put pressure on member states to take concrete actions to actually counteract gender-based violence in institutions. It's not all decided yet what kind of actions will be proposed by the Commission, but it's upcoming the coming years. And this turns into the third pillar called accountability. And accountability is about actually taking responsibility as a higher education institution for the consequences of gender-based violence. For example, having a formal reporting system that it's actually in place, it's known by students and staff, and it's being used to report incidents of gender-based violence. But also that there needs to be supportive structures and restorative measures in all higher education institutions in a national context. So I think it's a quite concrete policy that will be implemented in the upcoming years in all member states by the Commission. And it really puts an effort into being as concrete as possible. It's not just a policy paper that you can put in the drawer. You need to live up to certain standards as a research and innovation context in a specific national context. And we know that the evaluation and monitoring on this code of conduct, it's upcoming, and it's going to be quite important, because if we have a policy and no sanctions in place, if you don't live up to the policy, then there's just nothing in it really. But there will be sanctions in the future on this policy. So my advice would be to actually look into this code of conduct and be aware of that in the upcoming years, there will not be possible to get funding from the EU at all without living up to the basic requirements in this policy. So it's better to start the work now than to wait 2 or 3 years, and then you will not be eligible for funding anymore if you don't follow the principles in the code of conduct. So with this broad view on the policy framework, I think it's important also to say something about the concepts of the area of interest that is gender-based violence. And I'm using the UNICEF project to actually frame the issue of the concepts, because there's a lot of research on gender-based violence, of course. There's a lot of policy developments. Different national contexts use different concepts as well, as I imagine you do in Estonia, but you can correct me afterwards. But I think you probably speak up on sexual harassment to some degree, but maybe not use gender-based violence as your umbrella concept for developing policy at this point in time. I'm saying this because within UNICEF, we did a policy mapping in all member states, and it turned out that almost no country in the EU back then, this was 2022, had any idea of using the concept of gender-based violence in their policies. It was mainly sexual harassment used. So in UNICEF, we were a group of researchers and policy officers developing a kind of new understanding of gender-based violence as the main concept. And this definition actually is important because it tries to incorporate different forms of violence within one concept. So the areas of physical violence and sexual violence, also psychological violence, different forms of economical violence, and then all forms of harassment, we put them all into the definition of gender-based violence. And specifically, we said this needs to be targeted both in online and offline contexts. And I think the reason for this was twofold. One was, of course, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, where a lot of students and staff worked from home and on digital platforms in their research communities all throughout the EU. So we tried to pinpoint that this is also an online issue, but we also know that several countries and institutions have turned to digital platforms for learning and teaching. And this means harassment and other forms of violence is moving from the physical sphere into the digital. So what you see on the left side is actually the generic definition of gender-based violence. We want to capture all forms of violence, and then we list them, but also targeting them the online and offline contexts. Now, what do we know about the prevalence then on gender-based violence? Well, we have the UNICEF survey. Maybe you have heard about it before, but this was developed within the project. It is still the largest cross-cultural survey done in Europe on gender-based violence in the research sector. We targeted 15 different EU member states. We also included 46 research performing organizations. The field time for the survey was almost 4 months, and we translated the survey into all languages used, and it was a really massive work done by the research group, but also together with stakeholders in different countries. And we ended up with collecting over 42,000 responses from students, from administrative staff, from teachers and researchers throughout these 15 member states. And the results were quite astonishing. We discovered that nearly 2 in 3 respondents to this survey had experienced some form of gender-based violence, meaning that if you as a respondent have ticked one box saying, yes, I experienced this form of sexual violence, or yes, I experienced this form of psychological violence, then we counted this as you have been experiencing some form of gender-based violence. the time frame was since you as a student started out your studies or since you as part of the staff started out your employment. So we actually targeted the experiences of a really large number of students and staff throughout the EU. And what was really interesting is that there were almost no differences in prevalence between countries. So we had a quite even line of prevalence for different forms of violence in all countries. So whether you were being a researcher in Slovenia or a researcher in Ireland didn't make a difference in terms of the number of experienced forms of violence for those researchers. As you can see, we also have a lot of background variables targeting, for example, different minorities, and the results are really clear that if you belong to any minority, for example, the LGBTQ minority or the ethnic minority groups that we have in the research communities in the EU, we see that you are more likely to experience different forms of gender-based violence. This is all in line with other research on violence, of course, but it's important that we targeted different minority groups because Europe is changing. We have so many migratory processes ongoing in our countries. We also have new identities in our communities that we need to acknowledge, and their experiences are more severe to gender-based violence than the normative population. As you can see in the bottom line, 1 of 3 respondents had experienced some form of sexual harassment. So 1 in 3 of the respondents had experienced sexual harassment. Now, if we look at the detailed results from the survey, the UNICEF survey, what is interesting is that only 3% experienced some form of sexual violence, as you can see in the bottom staple. But on the top, you can see that psychological violence was the major experience. So I think what is important when we describe and discuss gender-based violence in our own national context, when we just target one specific experience, for example, sexual harassment or physical violence, we will miss out on the other forms of violences making up the total experience of an individual. Because this has been one of the key ideas within the UNICEF project, that all forms of violence are in relation to each other. And often respondents have difficult times to separate different forms of experiences from each other. Of course they do. So I think we have really made some progress on the idea of gender-based violence through the UNICEF project, targeting different forms in this sense. And just as a comparison, we did a Swedish survey at the same time, a national survey in Sweden on sexual harassment only. And as I think you know, Sweden, as Norway, Finland, has been pinpointed as the major countries in the globe on gender equality. We are scoring so high on gender equality indexes all the time. We are the kind of promised land of gender equality in the Nordics. And you might imagine that sexual harassment is not a core problem in our research community. But in our survey, using the same items and the same scales on sexual harassment as we did in the UNICEF survey, turned out to be this way. A total of 38% of the respondents had experienced some form of sexual harassment during their time as a student or as an employee. And really depressing is that more than half of the female PhD students in the Swedish research innovation area and sector had experienced sexual harassment. So things are not moving forward really. They are actually moving backwards. We have a lot of research, and I will turn back to this in the end. We have a lot of research on gender-based violence, on interpersonal violence and sexual violence in the global research community, actually showing that violence is actually increasing in many populations and many organizations. And we have recent studies in Sweden showing that violence is actually increasing. Men's violence against women especially is increasing in Sweden. And this has been corrected for reporting frequency and corrected for media developments and the Me Too movement and many other issues. So we are actually in a crisis, and it's not turning to the right way at this moment. So with this depressing news, I think it's also important to look into what happens with those being exposed to gender-based violence. Well, looking into the UNICEF survey again, we asked a lot of questions on why do you as a student or staff not report on the incidents that you have experienced? And looking from the top, you can see that the most common responses by our respondents to the UNICEF survey were, well, I was unsure if this behavior was actually serious enough to report. So one might say we have a large degree of normalization and neutralization of gender-based violence in our research communities in the EU at this point. And the second most common reaction was, well, I did not recognize this behavior as some form of violence at this time. That is, they have marked in the survey, yes, I did experience someone looking at me in an uncomfortable way and staring at my body, but they have not themselves considered this to be a form of gender-based violence. So there's a large gap between the knowledge among respondents on gender-based violence and the actual experiences of gender-based violence. And then the third most common, I did not think anything would happen even if I reported it. And from other studies, we know this specific reason usually is on top. It usually is the most common reason why someone experiencing violence and abuse in a research or education setting will not report the incident. And this is actually targeting the institutions that we run, the higher education institutions. If we have students and staff not even thinking it's going to be, nothing will happen if you report it, then we have a large culture of silence in our institutions where our own systems are promoting staff and students experiencing gender-based violence to keep quiet. And I think this is commonplace in many, many countries, also in Sweden, and I would suppose also in this Estonian community. So quite discouraging. We know that people don't report, and they don't report for certain reasons. And the reasons are they don't think it's serious enough, they don't see it as violence, and they don't think things will happen. And this turns to why we need to implement so many training sessions and information and awareness raising sessions in our research institutions to make people aware that this is a phenomena in place already. I also want to look into the consequences of gender-based violence as we screen them through the UNICEF survey. On the left-hand side, you can see the work-related consequences reported by staff. On the right-hand side, you see the students and their related consequences. And as you can see, the three top ones for staff is, well, this made me feel just dissatisfied with the job I'm having. I don't feel as a good researcher anymore, for example. Or I am not producing as much as I used to. I don't produce as much papers, or I don't like to go teaching. I think I'm a bad teacher and so forth. And then the third, which is quite important, is that they have been started to considering to leave the academic sector. And if you look down to, I think, the 8th row, you can also see that some of the respondents changed or tried to change the institution. That is, try to move away from the problem. And this is quite commonplace that victims and survivors of gender-based violence are moving away either by themselves or are forced by the institution to move away as a way to solve the problem instead of addressing the perpetrator and holding the perpetrator accountable. Now, on the study side, you can see students start to miss out on classes. They feel also dissatisfied with their studies, which is quite commonplace, and they experience they don't learn as much anymore. And they, as you can see, a couple of steps down, they also drop out on courses. So I would consider the consequences of gender-based violence in the UNICEF survey quite clearly displaying that this is actually a problem for the quality of research and education at this point in time. If we don't address gender-based violence, these will be the consequences for both staff and students. And we do want to promote excellence. We do want to promote quality in research and education, but we don't if we don't address the problem seriously. And I think turning to research and looking into consequences of gender-based violence, and me and my colleague, Maja Lundqvist in Sweden, we did a large research review on the consequences among many other things. And we published it, I think in 2020. Yes, this is 5 years ago. We looked into all research globally on sexual harassment and sexual violence in research communities, looking at 30 years of research. And we just pulled out this list of commonplace research-based evidence on consequences of gender-based violence. And as I think you can see, it starts from the individual level, that is stress, anxiety, depression, PTSD, but also attempts of an actual suicide as a consequence of gender-based violence. Then moving to different physical consequences, and then the dropouts, mobility, actual dropouts, the motivation issues, performance issues, the student learning, and so forth, all the way to, I would say, the limited academic freedom as researchers and teachers. Because, and this is one of the position papers that you can find on Gender Action Plus webpage that we wrote in my team, we can see that gender-based violence actually inhibits the right to do research and teaching as a teacher and researcher. And this means you don't live your academic freedom fully. And I think this is a really strong argument to put forward, especially in the times of the Trump administration trying to minimize academic freedom through targeting EDI officers and teachers and researchers, and also research projects containing any knowledge on gender and gender bias, for example, or gender-based violence. So yes, turning then from consequences, let's go to the issue of prevention, going from prevalence to prevention. How can we, as research officers or senior policies officers or research institutions, how can we actually mobilize to prevent gender-based violence in our institutions? How can we make sure that we address gender-based violence the right way? Well, there is so much knowledge on this, and I cannot give you all the input in this short lecture, but I really urge you, if you're interested, to visit the UNICEF website, because you will find an interactive toolkit developed for almost 3 years' time, where you will find so much information on, as I've been speaking up on today, for example, the concept use, the facts and figures, but also how to start out as an institution to develop a policy, to develop core measures, to organize sustainable training events, but also making sure that it lives on in the institutional work for a long period of time. There are so many also inspiring practices from different institutions and countries and other resources. What I brought with me today was the core model used in UNICEF, which is now incorporated in the Zero Tolerance Approach Code of Conduct by the Commission. And it's the 7 Ps framework. I will not dwell into detail because it's all too detailed to discuss today. But what I find important is that we try to move beyond what has been developed beforehand. In the Istanbul Convention on men's violence against women, there was a 3P framework, and the European Council developed a 4P model. Now we developed a 7P model, that is 7 Ps. And in the midst of it is the prevalence. And as I described from the Code of Conduct, it's important to acknowledge prevalence, whether you have done a survey or not. Because it's not a question of the survey, it's a question of acknowledging we have a problem with gender-based violence. Now then, it might be specific to a specific national context. You might have more problems with sexual harassment than, for example, online violence. So you have to map it and do a survey, of course. But we can start out by acknowledging prevalence. And then we need to understand that there are 4 specific Ps that we need to address as institutions if we want to address gender-based violence properly. And of course, we need to have preventive measures in place. And those are, for example, having training sessions for staff and students, having policy officers actually working with the issue and sharing and spreading information, and so forth. But we also need to protect our potential victims and survivors of gender-based violence, and that's the 2nd P in the bars. So protecting means actually having legal requirements on staff and students to report formally, or that we have organized within our institutions a formal procedure that will actually protect victims from being victimized through a formal reporting procedure, for example. And then again, there needs to be disciplinary measures, and they are part of the prosecution P. We know from many institutions that there are no sanctions or measures put in place to actually work against perpetrators. Instead, we have policies and we have a lot of important measures and reporting systems, but there are no ways that we can hold individual perpetrators or actually departments or the whole institution accountable for the violence being in place. So one important disciplinary measure might be that you get a withdrawal of your salary for 1 month's time if you have been found to be guilty of being a perpetrator of gender-based violence in your institution through a formal reporting procedure. This is in place in France or in Germany or also in Sweden in some institutions. And there are a lot of other disciplinary measures that we need to implement, not because we want to use them, but because they can work as something making staff and students aware that there will be consequences if you use sexist language or if you share pornographic pictures to students as a teacher and so forth. Finally, and maybe the most important P, is called provision of services. And this is all about how to support victims and survivors of gender-based violence. We do a lot in research institutions and higher education institutions in the EU, supporting victims of different forms of violence already, but it's not enough. We need to have a formal procedure for support. We need to be on track, giving support from day one when we get knowledge on some form of abuse within some form of academic community. And we need to be target specific for different groups of survivors and victims. And we need to have a lot of resources in place. And it needs to be long-term. We cannot just give advice as a counselor for 2 hours and then have a formal reporting procedure and then have a closing conversation. We need to have a long process of actually supporting victims. So this is why provision of services is such an important P. And then in the gray circle, you see the 2 final Ps. One is policy. Yes, we need to have a policy in place, defining gender-based violence, defining the measures, explaining why it's important to address gender-based violence, also then listing all the important measures that we want to use in our institution, but also different forms of evaluation and monitoring of the measures that we use. And then finally, partnerships is an important P. We cannot change the situation by ourselves. We need to create partnerships with student associations, with counselors, with the researchers on gender-based violence, with other stakeholders in the research community that we live in. So partnerships is just key. And we see that in the Irish higher education sector. They have implemented what they call the ESVH framework. It's called the Ending Sexual Violence and Harassment Framework. It's been ongoing for 4 years. It's been reviewed at the moment. I'm part of the review panel, but one of the strong elements of the model is that they use partnerships. There is no one interested in higher education which is not part of the framework. So you have research funders, and you have the ministry, and you have gender equality agencies, you have gender equality officers in the different communities. You have schools being part of the framework, but also, of course, all the different stakeholders within the research and innovation community. And this makes it really fruitful, and I would say a really good example on how to formulate an important policy with partnerships. So this is just in short. I don't know about the Estonian situation at the moment. If you have policies in place in all institutions, if you actually provide services to victims and survivors in a systemic and sustained manner, whether you have disciplinary measures in your institutions or not. And I'm not really sure whether there are strong legal requirements in place, both in law, but also within the institutions that could be used to prevent and prohibit further perpetrators and so forth. So this might be one issue to discuss further. I think what I've recognized traveling Europe for many years now is that when the Me Too movement turned out to be really important was back then in 2017, 2018, many countries developed these policies in higher education institutions. But in some countries, the Me Too movement was not that strong, and this did not have the effect on the research community that maybe was hoped for. And I don't know about the Estonian community either. Maybe you had a strong Me Too movement recently or back then in 2017. I'm really curious on this, whether this has had an impact on the research community or not. Okay, so I will go on for another, I think, 10 or 15 minutes. if you want core advice on how to actually work against gender-based violence, you have 6 different important policy papers from the UNICEF project. And you can find them on the UNICEF webpage. And I've also put some references into this presentation that I think are the key policy papers that are important to use for you for the future, if you're interested. I promised to say something also about the research funders. Part of the Gender Action Plus project was to target research funders specifically, and I was in charge of the work package on gender-based violence, and we actually targeted research funders now for 3 years, and we did some, I would say, amazing work in the project. In our first deliverable report, we did a benchmarking report. We benchmarked policy on gender-based violence within research funding organizations in Europe. And we, of course, found that almost none of them were into developing any policies or measures or ideas even on counteracting and ending gender-based violence in higher education institutions and research. So this was the starting point back in 2022. So we developed a conclusion that we need to have an ERA infrastructure for RFOs in place. And this turned into the second deliverable, an important work that we did, where we tried to map different preventive measures within research funding organizations. And we found some important examples, and they were presented in this deliverable report. So if you're a research funder, I think you should read this report, especially because you have so many nice examples of best practice that we developed and actually described in this report. But we also found that there is something in the way of research funders to actually take on the challenge. And that was mainly that they considered them not being responsible for gender-based violence in academic institutions. So a core argument put forward by research funders were that they cannot do anything because they are not the employers of staff and teachers, and they do not have any responsibility for students. That is the responsibility of higher education institutions and research institutions. Now, this is true, of course, but we spurred issues to the funders whether they could imagine other ways of taking on this challenge. And this turned out to be quite important work. And we found out that the idea of being ethical as a researcher was an important entry point to make research funders engaged. And this finally turned into a new model that we call the relief model that we have been developing the last year, and it's been implemented at the moment in several research funders in Europe as a pilot project. And we had also the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Health participating in this pilot. That is, the 2 major funders in the US were part of this pilot process where we tried to implement this model up until the new Trump administration. They were banned to be part of this project for the future. So now it's an ongoing pilot in European institutions, and the US is not taking part anymore, unfortunately. But this model actually does something really important. It says the following: well, if you consider yourself to be a funder and you cannot do anything, please at least do something with your own internal processes as a funder. So the R in the relief model, it stands for role clarity. That is, identify your potential role as a stakeholder being interested in ending gender-based violence. And then you turn to the E, the ethical governance. And the major measure that we propose is to consider research misconduct, how we can implement an understanding of gender-based violence as part of actually doing research misconduct. Because we know funders, they are really keen on not accepting research misconduct through their calls and their funding processes. So if we incorporate gender-based violence as one part of being not eligible for funding, if you have a history of gender-based violence, for example, or if you, as an institution, do not have a policy in place to address gender-based violence, then you do not live up to the standard of addressing research misconduct, and you will not be eligible for funding. This is being tried out at the moment in several funders in Europe. The legal part of the model, that is the L, the legal framework, is currently being scrutinized, and it's been tried out in Austria, but also in Sweden. There is a pilot developing the possibility to withdraw or withhold funding if an institution or a specific researcher that has been funded by a research funder turns out being a perpetrator in some way in terms of gender-based violence. Then there will be a retraction of funding for that person and project. Now, this looks quite different in different contexts. I know that in Sweden, 2 funders, they are trying to pinpoint that the PI will not get funding anymore for the project if there is a formal report on sexual harassment or other forms of sexual violence ongoing in the research group. Instead, the PI will get retracted funding, but the other researchers in the group, they will share the funding instead, and a new PI will be advised by the funder. So this is a way of saying, you as a PI, you have a responsibility to make sure there is no experiences of gender-based violence in your research group. If there are, and if this comes to our knowledge as a funder, we will retract your funding. I think this is a strong policy measure and a strong policy signal to individual researchers, but also institutions, that you will not get funding if you have gender-based violence ongoing. Then again, of course, the I in the relief model stands for internal procedures. That is, you as a funder needs to look through your funding process in itself. Is it possible to implement different measures concerning gender-based violence in your funding schemes? And this is also being tried out at the moment in Austria. For example, that RPOs, research performing organizations, they will have to declare that there are no ongoing experiences of gender-based violence within a specific research group applying for funding. And this means they need to map the actual situation in the workplace before applying for funding. And they need to put a project plan needs to incorporate this critical analysis and risk analysis of the research group beforehand. So this is a way of being eligible for funding. I think it's quite interesting if it turns out to be a good measure or not. And then, of course, the E turns into evaluation and monitoring. Research funders can do pilot visits at specific institutions and research groups, interviewing researchers on their experiences of gender-based violence, or sending out surveys to active projects that they are funding, and claiming the responsibility for all participants in research projects to answer a survey. And if the survey turns out that you have specific PIs having research groups reporting gender-based violence in some form, the research funder can take action and actually withdraw funding or have a conversation and communication with that PI. So that's also a way of using commonplace evaluation and monitoring processes within a funder, also for gender-based violence. And then finally, there is an F, and that stands for funding. We think it's important that there is also funding on research on gender-based violence within research and education systems. So the F is actually all about proactive approaches to fund research on this issue in itself. Okay, quite quick and quite short. Let me turn to my last page, my last slide, the take-home messages, and then we can start the questions and answers session. I hope you have some questions and it will not turn all silent. That's also that's really not the best. So I hope you have some questions in the end. So I just put together some of my own current ideas on what is important to bring with us when we work in this area, within the European research area, more broadly on gender-based violence. And the first is that we need to acknowledge what I term violence is autotelic. This means that it's not enough to understand that certain individuals in our institutions might experience some form of gender-based violence at some point in time. Instead, we need to acknowledge that when a student experiences, for example, sexist language in a classroom, this spurs experiences of your time in school or back in home. That is, you have as a student, you bring with you lifelong experiences of violations and abuse that are being activated as you confront sexist language in the classroom. So you will react not to the incident. You will react in line with your own experiences as an individual, a life course experience of violence. This means the consequences will be severe, not due to the severity of the specific incident, but due to the lifelong history of experiencing different forms of gender-based violence. And this turns especially into the group of females in our systems, but also other marginalized groups in our systems. We need to understand that violence is already in place in people's lives, and they bring it with them to our classrooms and to our laboratories and to different conferences and so forth. So don't blame the survivors, blame the perpetrators, please. Then again, I think from my experience, being part of all these projects, being, developing policies here in Sweden since the mid-90s on sexual harassment especially, I've come to recognize that our measures and our targets and our training sessions, they are not enough. They are important, but they are never enough, because we tend not to target specifically the academic cultures that make perpetrators feel free to be violent and abusive. So what we have started to coin in research the last 10 or 15 years is all about toxic academic cultures, sometimes called toxic masculinities in our academic cultures. And we need to visualize them. We need to name them and frame them and actually call out all those perpetrators at the moment being in our institutions. They need to get support themselves to turn away from their abusive behaviors. So usually we tend to blame those working with ending gender-based violence and sexual harassment, but we should actually blame ourselves, not systemically targeting our own academic cultures. So this is actually about cultural change and institutional change. It's not so much about policies, really. It's really about institutional change and cultural change. And we tend to forget that when we do our policies. Then again, I've seen many examples of nice preventive work on gender-based violence in many, many contexts. I think the most effective have been those which have been connected to some form of sanctions. And it has not been economic sanctions or legal sanctions. It has been what I call academic sanctions. So just imagine that if you have had a track record of being accused of gender-based violence in your institution, then you are not eligible to be promoted to professor. This is an academic sanction that is put in place in one German university back in the 1980s, which was the most effective academic sanction I've seen. Because if everyone in the staff group knows that you cannot be a professor if you get accused of sexual harassment, which was the word used back then you will not be eligible for a position as a professor. So you will retract from being violent and being abusive. You will be really, really careful in how you use your language, how you address your students, and how you interact with colleagues. And this was actually happening in this German institution. You had a group of professors in the end being really, really, really female and not male. And they were also conscious of the issue of gender-based violence. This was a project for 8 years' time in the 1980s. But there are also other academic sanctions we can use, because we know that academics, they react to academic status, not to legal status or to economic sanctions. It's academic sanctions that will work in the end. So if we can find out different academic sanctions, we will change our cultures, I'm sure. Then again, I think the major problem is that institutions are never held accountable for gender-based violence. We always look at the individual cases. One person being abused by another person in a specific setting. This is the problem. This is how we address the problem currently and in many, many ways. I think if we start holding the institutions accountable for not addressing gender-based violence, this will spur change in institutions. This will spur institutional change. And I think withdrawing funding, research funding, will be key for change. And as I said, this is a pilot ongoing. And I think this is something that the Commission is really looking into at the moment. And I think we will see in 2 or 3 years' time economic sanctions in terms of research funding on specific institutions not living up to the standards according to this code of conduct that I presented. And then finally, as I said, men's violence against women is increasing. We know that from research from 20, 30 years on. It's not a problem that is going away by itself. We are not getting more democratic, more gender equal in the globe, not even in the Nordic context. We are turning it the other way around due to many different developments. For example, neoconservative, right-wing populist, quite autocratic developments in many countries. We know that democracies are moving backwards at the moment, and we are losing other democracies globally at the moment. So violence is actually gaining ground in our communities. So yes, don't give up, but please acknowledge that we have to keep on the fight, all of us. And that will be my final words. If you want to contact me, please do. And I will stay on, of course, with this question and answer session, but please contact me on my email address. I can answer all your questions if you have any, if you don't put them forward today on this session.